Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about Designer Lilibet, the issues she runs into in her current state, as well as my ideas for buffs and changes. My topics will be separated into three sections: her mechanics and playstyle, the problems she faces in her kit, and what changes I think she could receive. And I'll include timestamps for all of these in the description below. Delibet was released as a counter to the control meta, which at the time was Cerise and Fairy Tale Tenebria, two openers who were able to lock you down at the start of the match with Unbuffable, Provoke, and other debuffs to prevent you from taking your turns in retaliation. This was a combo that was frequently seen in all modes of PvP, and was the basis for Delibet's kit. Delibet's main gimmick revolves around her S2, Emergency Stitching, comboed with her S3, Model Disqualification. Emergency Stitching essentially works like this. Delibet starts with 50 Fighting Spirit, and at the end of each enemy turn, she gains 5 Fighting Spirit for each debuff on an ally, meaning that if Angel of Light Angelica, for example, landed all 8 of her debuffs on your team, Delibet would gain 40 Fighting Spirit after the turn ends. After enough enemy turns occur to give her full Fighting Spirit, Delibet will cleanse herself and gain a combat readiness push of 40%, allowing her to cut in front of her team and take her turn. She can then activate Model Disqualification, which will decrease all debuff durations on her team by 2 turns, cleansing most debuffs and allowing her team to take their turns freely. However, after the Cerise F10 opener combo started disappearing, Delibet's usage died down drastically along with her counterpart, as she just wasn't really that great of a pick in anything else, similar to what happened with Holiday Yuvine and Bazaar, which brings me to the next topic. What are Designer Lilibet's main issues? Firstly, her passive requires far too many debuffs to activate. Let's use ML Angelica as an example. If she inflicts at least 5 of her 8 potential debuffs on your team, and another enemy takes a turn afterwards, Delibet will be pushed up from her passive, allowing her to cleanse her team. This is the intended situation for Delibet's kit to work, as the Cerise F10 meta she was released into are basically guaranteed to activate her passive. However, this would assume that you pick units that are slower than at least 2 of your opponent's units, which would mean that you are already at a disadvantage, as your opponent now has free reign over the start of the match. Additionally, situations also occur in which a character like Cerise could stun Delibet, preventing her from gaining a large amount of fighting spirit. Cerise could then use her S3 after Delibet has lost her turn, and when Delibet's passive pushes her forward, the amount wouldn't be large enough to take the turn immediately and cleanse her team. But how about another scenario, where you try to speed contest their opener and fail? If Angelica takes her turn and you have 1 or 2 allies taking the turn after, Delibet won't push herself forward, meaning your faster allies will take their turns with the debuffs intact, rendering Delibet far less effective in comparison to a dedicated support who can simply take a quicker turn and cleanse the team. Secondly, Delibet doesn't really fit in a dedicated role. As a cleanser, she's overshadowed by traditional soul weavers like Maid Chloe and Amelia, who can be built for speed and take a turn faster. Mediator Carrick, a much more consistent offensive cleanser, who can also be built with 0 effect resistance, has a built-in mechanic to remove most shorter debuffs like stuns or silences that would prevent him from being able to use his AoE cleanse, thus making him a very strong competitor for Delibet. Finally, Delibet just isn't very useful after she cleanses her team. She doesn't offer any support to her allies after her cleanse, and doesn't pose much of a threat to enemies due to not having any real offensive or supportive capabilities. Here's a fun fact. Designer Lilibet is one of the only defense scaling characters who doesn't have an innate defense buff, which quite frankly is disappointing considering her status as an ML5. So how can we fix these issues? In my opinion, Designer Lilibet needs 3 things: faster passive cycling, presence on the field, and a unique identity to fit into. Here are the changes that I would suggest. When coming up with these changes, my main priority was to focus on Delibet's theme as a designer, as well as her playstyle of benefiting from debuffs. She can now push forward more reliably, and can utilize debuffs in a more offensive manner. I also wanted to boost her combat ability through an innate defense steroid, and also give her the image of someone who continuously fixes up an ally and keeps them in the fray with her. Let's start off with her S2 changes. The first change is her gaining fighting spirit on her allies' turns. This is key to making Delibet's kit more reliable, as consistent fighting spirit gain is currently one of her main issues. It also allows for faster units to be drafted with her, giving the person picking Delibet more control over the battle, rather than being forced to watch their units lose turn after turn, or waiting for the enemy to gain a huge upper hand before being able to cleanse. Another idea I've seen is increasing her fighting spirit gain to 10 rather than 5, and keeping the gain to the end of an enemy's turn. While this does fix the issue of Delibet struggling to activate her passive, I don't think that this solves the issue of Delibet's inconsistent fighting spirit gain. I also think that lowering the threshold for just 5 debuffs to land from the enemy's opener would be a bit too strong, as it would enable her as an auto pick into almost every debuff based opener, and we all know what happens to units that can be picked essentially anywhere. The combat readiness increase percentage remained the same, as I don't see Delibet being able to abuse the passive after her initial cleanse. Even with the increased gain of fighting spirit, most debuffing abilities don't come off cooldown that frequently, bar an exception like Angelica and Spirit's Breath. The next change is that Delibet gains 10% defense increase, stacking up to 5 times whenever she procs her passive. This is similar to a combination of Landy and Pilis' passives, and it would keep Delibet's main strength to be picked into debuffers, as she needs to activate her passive to get the defense bonus. I think that this is better than a self-granted defense buff because if she is buffed alongside her push, there's a good chance that she won't be keeping it for long unless she is pushing from 0% combat readiness. The 5-stack requirement also keeps her from becoming tanky too quickly, allowing enemies to focus her before she scales up. The last change is personally one of my favorite additions to her kit. Grants the ally with the lowest defense increased defense for 1 turn. I think this plays into the designer concept of creating clothing extremely well, and gives her a unique ability as a support that can upgrade the armor of one of her allies. This ability would not only give Delibet a role as an offensive support unit, but also gives her presence on the field, as she would be providing defense buff to an ally while she is alive. This could also be changed to something along the lines of, give the lowest combat readiness ally increased defense for 1 turn, as to not run into the issue stated earlier where the defense buff would wear off quickly. Let's move to her S3. As she stands currently, Delibet's S3 just doesn't do much. Sure, you get a reset, but that would usually be after your opponent has already used their skills, not to mention immunity on slower characters. Therefore, I wanted to give her a more utility-oriented approach, as the designer would mainly be concerned about the armor of their allies. This change ended up being, grant an ally a turn of defense buff for each debuff that was cleansed, which implies her fixing up the armor of her teammates amidst the battle. Additionally, she now inflicts 1 debuff cleanse on each ally to an enemy. The goal of this was to add on to her comeback playstyle when casting her S3, and being able to use the debuffs to her own advantage against openers, who would most likely not have much effect resistance. While this does take away from characters like Champion Zerato or Glimmyrain, I think transferring a single debuff would make it more of an addition to her kit, rather than taking over as an identity. One mechanic I did add to this debuff effect was the importance of row placement. I don't think this is necessary as having the debuffs being randomly inflicted on enemies would make the ability less predictable, but I do believe it would be a cool addition for PvP, where you can predict enemy imprints and move units accordingly. Delibet does now become a bit similar to ML Cowrick in the sense that they both cleanse and buff on their S3, but I think that this ability change would make her more of an offensive, turn the fight around type of character, with the addition of debuff transfer, rather than Cowrick's slower approach to giving his own team offensive buffs. So in conclusion, these are my suggestions for Delibet's buffs/changes. I did leave out her S1, but in my opinion, it's a pretty basic skill and probably doesn't need to be changed. If you agree or disagree with any parts of the video, or think something might be a bit too overpowered or underpowered, let me know in the comments below. I'm a big fan of Delibet's character design, and really hope that Smilegate gives her some love. Anyway, thanks for watching guys. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and feel free to subscribe. It's really encouraging to see feedback on my videos, and helps me figure out what kind of content to make in the future. You can find my Twitter in the description, where I usually post updates on what I'm working on for my videos. Have a good one, and I'll see y'all next time.